You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 240. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my dear friend. Welcome back to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me here this week. If you are listening to this episode when it goes live, then it is the day before Christmas 2025. So you may be, if you're like me and you celebrate Christmas, you may be putting on all the finishing touches. In other words, making sure all the presents are wrapped, they're tucked under the tree. You've got all the food you need for whatever meal you're having tomorrow. You know, there's Christmas cheer in the air. Maybe you don't celebrate Christmas, but you celebrate Hanukkah or Kwanzaa. And so you are celebrating with your family, with your friends, and you are in the festive cheer mode. Or maybe you don't really celebrate any of those holidays, but you're still caught up a little bit in the end of year spirit. This is a really joyous time of year. It is kind of one of those times of year that it's a little bit cooler. Typically, I mean, if you're in the northern hemisphere, of course. And there's so much celebration and reflection that goes on this time of year. So it's a really neat time of year. I hope you are having a good time. I hope this is a really happy time of year for you. I know it can be so hard with the holidays. And so, my heart goes out to anybody who is going through something, whether it's the recent loss of a loved one or difficult relationship with somebody over the holidays. And, I'm so glad to have you here, and I'm so grateful to have you in my life. So today, what I would love to talk to you about is the gift of letting things go. And the reason that I would love to talk about this today is that we're in that season, right? We are in that season of giving. And so often we think of giving as adding to, right? When you give a gift, you typically go out and you find a physical gift. Maybe it's something beautiful like jewelry, or it's something functional like a new, toaster, blender, or, in my daughter's case, we got her a sewing machine last year. I mean, it could be anything, right? But there's the physical gifts, there's experiences, right? Maybe you take somebody on a trip, or you take them for a beautiful meal. Chances are you're cooking your favorite foods, you're giving so many things, right? There's things that are tangibly going from one person to another. And what I thought would be really interesting today would be to think about that giving, but from a different perspective. Instead of looking at what we are adding into your life or adding into the life of somebody else, what if we looked at the gift as more of a release, right? Releasing yourself from things that maybe you no longer wish to do, and the freedom that comes from that. So maybe it's the time freedom, maybe it's the emotional freedom, maybe it's just relief, letting something go. So that is the gift that I'm going to share with you today. And what I'm going to do is walk you through a few types of gifts that you could give yourself, different things that you might release. And when I think about this time of year in particular, so tomorrow, when this goes live, not real tomorrow because I'm recording this episode before Christmas Eve, I know that my house, right, will be covered in clutter, right? There will be wrapping paper everywhere, ribbons, there will be pine needles. We got a real tree this year, so there will be pine needles everywhere. There's probably going to be food wrappers and all the things. And so typically what I do this time of year is not on Christmas and maybe not Boxing Day, but usually sometime between Christmas and New Year, I take a day or two and I declutter the house. And it usually takes me a full day. I declutter Christmas stuff, but I also declutter a lot of other things that have piled up in the house. And you might do something similar. And so I use this as an analogy because it's a tangible, visible analogy. And, when you think about that type of decluttering, there are some things that are immediate and obvious things that you can declutter. The wrapping paper on the floor, easy. Nobody ever is going to miss that. You're never going to use it again. But then there are items that are a little bit more complicated, right? If you think about gifts, for example, that somebody maybe gave you and it's not really something that you'll ever use, but they gave it to you. And so you feel this sentimental attachment to it. Is that something that you keep or do you give it away? And maybe you don't struggle with that, but maybe you do. So there's going to be different layers in terms of the things you give away. And so for today's episode, I've identified 5 non-tangible things that you may choose to release, that you may let go of this year. And what I'm going to do is present them in the order that I think is easiest. So kind of that wrapping paper analogy to what is probably the hardest. So that would be more in the nature of a blanket that someone in your family knitted for you that you'll never use, but you feel too awkward to throw it away. You feel like that would be wrong, that you would be a bad person if you did that. There's a sentimental attachment. Maybe it's a gift from somebody who has passed away and you don't want to lose your attachment to that person. So you hold on to the thing. There's so many layers. And so we're going to start with the easiest one first, and then we're going to work our way through it. And what I would love for you to take away from today's episode is that there are different layers of what I am hoping to do. One is simply to plant the seed that this is possible for you. That's one layer. The next is an invitation to think about doing it or to actually do it. Encouragement if you need it, if you know it's something that you want to do and you just need a little bit of a boost, a cheerleader on the side. And then finally, permission, the permission to do something that maybe you feel like you need permission for. And ultimately, you're the one who needs to give yourself permission. But if you need someone else to give you permission, I give you that permission. So with that, we're going to start into Santa's list, the list of things that you can release. And I'm excited to share it with you. I would also encourage you to think about items that are not on this list that maybe you would add to your list, because this is the list that I came up with, but there may be other amazing things that you could let go of that would make your life so much better. And so include that in your list. So let's start with gift number 1. So this is the low-hanging fruit, if you will, and that is to release the extras. And I think the best way to think about this, the extras are those things that you're doing, maybe out of habit, maybe because other people like it when you do it, that you are ready to let go. And funnily enough, as I'm speaking, I can think of one thing, which is at our Christmas dinners, I have traditionally made the gravy. And I think my mom does this because, she always says you're really good at making the gravy, but I wonder if maybe she says that because maybe nobody else wants to make it. Anyways, my brother actually loves making the gravy, or at least it seems like he loves making the gravy. So, the past few times we've had a turkey, which is usually Christmas or Thanksgiving, I've kind of let that role go, and other people seem to pick it up, and I don't feel badly about it. So that's an example of one of those extras, right? Something that you've been doing because it's tradition, but maybe you've kind of grown out of it and it's time to let the task fall to somebody else, maybe who wants to do it and who can maybe do it better. And so the first gift, the first thing that I'd invite you to release is that thing that maybe you're ready to let somebody else take on, that maybe you've outgrown, you don't really want to do it anymore. And you might think of this in terms of the Pareto principle, which is the idea that 80% of your results will come from 20% of your effort. And this is generally true about a number of things. I've talked about it in the podcast before in relation to professional work and things you might do in your practice. But here, if you're just thinking about your life in general, where are there areas where you are doing things that you're in that 80%? You're putting in a lot of extra time and effort, but you're at the 20% return. And so you're starting to feel a bit exhausted. You're starting to feel like, oh, this is a lot. And believe me, making the gravy, it's such a small example. So that's not exactly what I'm talking about. it's a small example of maybe other areas where this is kind of a routine, it's kind of a habit, and you're ready to let these things go. So ask yourself where there may be things that you're doing out of habit, out of routine, out of this kind of default way of how you see the world, and is this something that you want to let go? So I thought it would be helpful to maybe think about a few examples. So maybe your normal response to a social invitation is to always say yes. And maybe you find that you're getting a little bit tired because you're always out doing things. And sometimes you just want to say, you know what, like, oh, I can't do it. And so maybe that's something that you let go. Maybe it's your clients email you and you feel like you absolutely must respond to them that very day with a complete and wonderful answer. And maybe you give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. Maybe you still respond to the client that same day, but maybe the response is, I will respond more substantively by whatever time. So thinking of some of the standards that you might have that maybe they are absolutely essential. Maybe there's some wiggle room there. Maybe you are in an environment at home where you're trying to have like these Martha Stewart standards. And what you realize is that you live a busy life and you have other people living in your house and there is a lot happening and you don't have to be the person to always clean that up. And so maybe you're lowering the standards there. And then finally, if you're a parent like me, then you might look at your children and you might think about all the things that you do. And are there things that you're doing right now that maybe you do because you think it's the right thing to do, or you think maybe it makes a difference, but if you really reflect on it, you don't think that the benefit is worth the effort? And I'm not talking myself about the things that you think are really important. I know for myself, there are areas in terms of parenting where I am not willing to budge. There are standards that I hold very dearly. And typically those are in the nature of who I want to be as a mom, how I want to support my kids, how I want them to feel. But there are other things like keeping a super tidy house, as you've probably inferred already, or making sure that every meal is absolutely perfect, or, always going to every single event or doing the extras. Like there's certain things that I just think, it's okay if I don't do those things. And in some cases, it's probably better if I don't. So that's my first invitation to you. Those are some examples of things that you might consider letting go of, those easy categories, right? The extras that you're doing that you can say, you know what, I'm okay not doing those things anymore. So for this category, I'm going to offer you a challenge. I'm actually going to ask you to think of 3 things in your life that you are doing right now and to consider letting them go or actually let them go. So this is your permission to cut corners, as it were. Think of 3 things. 1, 2, 3. And this is your invitation and perhaps permission to say, as of today, I no longer am going to do these things. Freeing. So that brings us to the second gift. And this is the release of timelines. Oh, and it is such a good one. So this might be a little bit harder to do than giving away or releasing those extras. But I have noticed, and I have fallen into this trap many times, that sometimes we get really attached to timelines. And for some cases, yes, let's adhere to the timeline. And in other cases, let's let them go. Now, I am a huge fan of timelines. And if you ever work with me in a coaching capacity, one of the first things we will probably do is talk about timelines for how we're going to work together, timelines for your goals. And the reason that we start there is because timelines create a container. They create a structure in what is often an intangible thing, right? I mean, sometimes it's tangible in the sense that if you go from one job to another, that is a tangible switch. That is something that would happen. If you go from feeling really stressed about your practice to feeling much more at ease, that's intangible, right? But the goal here is to set a timeline so that we have a container and we know what we are working toward. If you're a litigator, chances are when a file comes in that would go to trial, one of the first things that you will do is to set a trial date. Once that action has been commenced, you're going to set a trial date. Why? Because it puts an end to that event, It's now got a finite end. And once that happens, all the steps leading up to it crystallize. You know what needs to happen and when. All the deadlines start to fall into place. Similarly, if you are a solicitor or a deal lawyer, chances are you pick a date, a closing date. So you know that X number of things need to happen by that date. It creates a structure. So I'm a big fan of having a deadline or a timeline or a target date, whatever you want to call it, because it creates structure. And I am also a big fan of not letting that timeline dictate the way that you feel about yourself, certainly, and also dictate the way that things unfold. So if you've ever been involved in a trial that settles, of course, you know that sometimes the situation changes. That goal that you had, that thing that you were working toward, is no longer necessary. Something has shifted. Same with a deal, right? You might have a closing date for a big transaction. And once the parties start to do a bit of diligence, they realize, you know what? We don't want to do this after all. And so it's okay to let things go, to have the timeline almost disappear. It's also okay if something happens, the case is more complicated than you thought it was, or there are approvals that you need that are outstanding. You can always shift those timelines. The thing that you're aiming for will still happen. The goal will still be reached, but it might not be reached on exactly the timeline that you thought it would be. And the key here isn't that you give up on the goal or you give up on the dream. You might question whether it's a goal or a dream that you want for yourself, but do you need to do it on the timeline that you originally proposed for yourself? And a really useful analogy for anybody who has ever negotiated, or actually anybody who has probably been alive, because what you'll see, right, as a negotiation tactic, for example, is pressure created by a timeline. If you have something where you're negotiating with a client, it's not with a client, sorry, your client's negotiating with, an opposing party. And one of the things, as a litigator, we used to do this, right? We would have pressure, right? Naturally created by the fact that a big event was coming up, right? If you've got a big trial date coming up and your client and the opposing clients are all concerned about, there's this big trial and, maybe it's not going to go our way and it's going to be really expensive. It puts pressure for a settlement, right? It puts pressure to make a decision. And similarly, if you are buying something, right? And this happens all the time, buy today because it's only on sale, for 24 more hours, there's this pressure to do something. And sometimes that pressure can lead us to make decisions that maybe aren't the best decisions, or they're decisions that we've made not necessarily under duress, right? Not necessarily under that high of a standard, but one that we made because of a timeline. And so if you're putting that pressure on yourself to do something by a certain date, sometimes that can actually force you into a decision that isn't ultimately the best decision for you. So I'm inviting you to let timelines be a guide. Let them do the things that they do well, like create structures, create timelines, crystallize the steps needed to get somewhere, make things more real, 100%. And I also am giving you permission to let those timelines go when it is appropriate, when it serves your longer term objectives. Let those timelines go. So that is your second category of permission or release that you can enjoy this season, the gift of letting those timelines go. So a few examples that might be on your agenda, gifts that you might give yourself. So career milestones is a big one. I work with lawyers who sometimes, for whatever reason, have big goals, but they know that they're going to have to have the timeline for those goals be slower than what they really initially wanted. So a classic example is when you become a parent, and what you find is that instead of being solely focused on work and career, and by solely focused, I mean, you probably have other things going on in your life, but the big responsibility that you feel is toward career-related commitments. Whereas when you're a parent, then you've got this other extremely valuable focus. You've got this role as parent where you've got children that you're caring for, and you've got this family that you're really committed to. And so it's not just a career, it's now career and family and whatever else you have going on in your life. And so naturally timelines may shift, right? You might decide that a role that you were really interested in involves a lot of travel, and it's not something that you're willing to do right now. Maybe you are, but maybe not. Or maybe there's a role that you know is going to require a certain level of time invested day to day that you're not willing to give up. Maybe there's rigidity, right? You need to be at an office. And right now what you really want is to be in a work situation where you can work from home. So the timeline might be impacted by things that are happening outside of work, and that is okay. That is a gift you can give yourself to release the pressure to do things by a certain time, because you have introduced other things into your life that you want to prioritize. And it doesn't have to be kids. It could be your health. It could be other family members. It could be travel. It could be hobbies. It could be anything. So allow yourself that gift. It could also be if you are a parent and you're looking at your children and the milestones that they are reaching. Children will reach milestones when they reach those milestones. And it's okay for them to have different timelines. And sometimes that is nice to reflect on, because I think sometimes we want things to go faster, and maybe it's okay for them to slow down a little bit. So those are the main things. And so in terms of maybe challenges or takeaways, what I would invite you to think about here is, are there one or two things, one or two areas in your life where maybe you feel a time pressure right now? And my invitation to you is simply to question what the timeline is, and are you okay with that timeline? Or do you want to adjust it to allow yourself to have a bit more ease, a little bit more expansiveness, a little bit less pressure, so that you can still go after the goal? You can still follow the steps, but you do it in a way that feels a little bit better, that feels a bit more, I would say, grounded, and you're still making progress, but just not in that high pressure state. That brings us to number 3. And again, we are going in ascending order of level of challenge. So this is to release success strategies and identities. Now, this is getting tougher, right? I mean, if we started with the tinsel that fell off the tree and the wrapping paper thrown on the floor, I mean, now we're getting closer almost like to the Christmas tree, right? If you're one of those people that likes to have your tree up for a few weeks after Christmas to bask in the memories of a golden Christmas, then it might be hard to take that tree and put it in the lane or to the tree place where they, chop up your tree and you say goodbye. So it can be tougher. And this is the case with strategies and identities. And the idea here is that there are strategies that you have used to get to where you are today. And those strategies have been very effective because you have reached a level of success that you really wanted. And you also probably have heard that expression, what gets you here won't get you there. The thinking that got you here is not the same thinking that will get you there. And so this is a bit tougher, because there are strategies, and then sometimes what you'll find is that those strategies are also coupled with something deeper, which is an identity. The person that you see yourself as being who is executing those strategies. So I'll give you a few examples of strategies that you might have that have allowed you to reach a certain level of success, and also the identity that you might attach to that. So for example, you might have used for a strategy that you do everything yourself, right? You know it is going to get done. You know it will get done to a certain standard. You don't have to worry about somebody else not getting it right, and maybe you feel good as a result. And it may also have some challenges, right? You become a bottleneck, or you might find that you're exhausted, that maybe you become a bit resentful. Maybe you are blocked from taking on something that you would rather do more. And so a new strategy might be to delegate some of the things that you are doing, or stop doing them, right? And both of those might feel really uncomfortable, right? If you delegate, that means a whole new skill set. It means taking on new team members or new people in your life who will take on roles that you have done up until this point. Not doing something feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it means having to set a boundary or say no to something that you typically do, and it could disappoint people. It could feel very unnatural at first. And so that might be a strategy that has gotten you to where you are today, and you're super excited about that. And yet you know that it's a strategy that maybe you're ready to let go. So that is one example. Another strategy might be that you're that 24/7 go-to person, right? That is a strategy. I see a lot of lawyers who are that person, where you are responding to your emails all the time. You are the person that people know they can go to when, the file has gone sideways, and you'll be there in a pinch and you'll fix everything and it's great. And, if you want something done, you give it to a busy person and that person is you. And in many ways, that probably makes you a very valuable, contributing member of your team. And it may also mean that by being 24/7, you are not able to do other things. And it may mean that the type of work that you're bringing into your life is that type of work that has short fuses, that has these high levels of complexity. And maybe you love that. And maybe you're also at a stage of life where what you want is to have a practice that's a little bit different in terms of its makeup, in terms of the substance of what you're doing, and perhaps also possibly the pace. And so you may want to hold on to a part of that identity. You may still want to be the go-to, but maybe you don't want to be the 24/7 go-to. So that would require the discomfort of letting go of that part of you, that strategy of being the 24/7 go-to person. Now, a third example of a strategy might be if you base your actions, if you base your decisions to respond or react to other people's emotions. So this might come up at work. It might come up outside of work. But you might notice that you do things because you're afraid of the emotional response that somebody else might have. For example, guilt tripping, right? If somebody tries to guilt trip you into something and you do it because you just don't want that guilt, right? You want to make them happy. Anger, right? Some people get in a big tizzy about, sorry, I shouldn't say tizzy. I mean, anger sometimes has a very legitimate place. In fact, it probably often has a very legitimate place. But, you're afraid of somebody getting angry, or they are angry, and so you're doing it because you want to appease them. Or maybe that person is really anxious. You can tell that they're really nervous. Maybe you have a client like that who's really nervous. And so you do their work first because you're responding to their anxiety. You don't want them to feel anxious. And so you're doing it first, even though maybe it's causing you a lot of anxiety. Maybe it's making you do things, or it feels like it's making you do things that are a lower priority, but you're getting it done because they're anxious. And so you might just question, right? Are there things that you're doing in your life, whether it's at work, whether it's outside of work, and the reason that you're doing it is because you want that other person to not feel a certain way. And again, this might be a strategy that has worked really well, right? People are not upset. They can rely on you to do things that they want them to. But you might also find that for you, it's not really working out long term. So the new strategy there might be that instead of doing all the things and being very strongly influenced by other people's emotional responses or anticipated emotional responses, instead of making decisions from that place, you pause and you decide from a more grounded place what makes the most sense in the situation. And in a way, it's almost like that time pressure, right? If you let go of the artificial timelines or the deadlines that are making you feel really stressed and anxious and hurried in your work, this might be similar to that. You let that pressure go, and then you can make decisions from a more grounded place. So I mentioned there were strategies and potentially corresponding identities. So for example, if you're letting go of that identity of doing everything yourself, you might have a reputation as a superstar, as a workhorse, as, the person that can and will do everything. So you might need to let that go. You might have a reputation as the go-to, the problem solver, the person who can fix everything. And if you let go of that strategy, then you may also need to let go of that identity. And finally, if you're a person who is making sure that everybody around you feels good, that they are happy, then you might be known as, that selfless giver, that generous person, the dependable one. And you might need to give that up if you are going to start to have more of a process that will govern how you make your decisions. And so it can be really challenging, right? If you want to give up strategies, if you want to give up identities, on the one hand, you'll know that the long-term effect of it will be overall better for you and possibly for others, possibly those same people who are right now enjoying the benefit of that. They may actually enjoy greater benefits when you choose to do things differently. They might have a more honest relationship with you. They may find that they're able to do things for themselves that they didn't know that they could do. If you're, for example, no longer doing everything yourself and you're giving other people opportunities to step up and step in, they might really benefit from the opportunities, from the learning, from the opportunity to work with you, to learn from you. So there's all of these different places where there's a potential benefit. And so the invitation here is to consider what strategies and what identities you may wish to release and to enjoy the benefit of the freedom that would be on the other side of that. And in the new year, I have a podcast episode. I recorded it a few weeks ago and I wanted to wait until after the holidays. It's about grieving loss, and it's with a wonderful counselor. Her name is Jane Rosswarn. And so that episode is coming up probably in January. So please do keep an eye out for it. And it's such a great conversation because it's all about the grief of loss. And we think about loss as being something like, you lose a job or you lose a family member or you lose an opportunity or you lose something really big, something that kind of affects you very profoundly, especially when you're losing somebody who is close to you. And so what I would love for everyone who listens to that episode is to also see places where there's a loss, and because it's not in a category that you would normally think of as a loss, you don't really give yourself the grace and the time to process it. And so that episode, I think, will really help with that. So if it's hard for you to give up an identity or it's hard to give up a strategy, then part of that is allowing yourself to go through the process of giving up something that has really, it's been a friend, right? It's been something that's really helped you get to where you are. So again, just the takeaway here is to maybe identify one thing that you're doing, maybe a couple of things that you're ready to let go, that you're ready to invite a new strategy. And that brings us to gift number 4. And that is to give up negative self-talk, or to release negative self-talk. Now, negative self-talk in itself may be a strategy that you've used in the past because you believe that if you have negative self-talk, it will help you achieve your goals, right? I think sometimes we'll use negative self-talk to temper disappointment, right? If you tell yourself that, that thing that you just wrote was really terrible and whoever is going to read it is going to judge you for it, that they're going to tell you that it's bad, that it wasn't good enough, then you've already done that for yourself. You've already lowered your own expectations in terms of what's going to happen, so you won't be disappointed. Sometimes you can use negative self-talk as a motivator, oh, you're so lazy, you really should get this done. Or there's all these ways, right? There's all these ways that negative self-talk plays a role in terms of a strategy. Now, is it the most effective strategy? I would say no. I would say that something really shifted for me when I heard someone say that if you use negative self-talk as a strategy to perform better, then what you might actually be doing is performing not as well. And that if you think, well, I've gotten to where I am because I've been so hard on myself, what if the truer way of looking at that, or another way of looking at that, would be to say, look at how far I've come, even when I've been so hard on myself. Almost as though, imagine how far you could go, or how much further you could go if the messaging you gave yourself was positive. And, to think about that because it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do sometimes. But if we go back to that time analogy, are you doing better work because you're putting pressure on yourself to do it fast? Maybe in some cases, right? It helps you to focus, but is it making the quality of your work better? Or if you're with somebody who is really critical of you, right? They're criticizing you at every step of the way. Are they making you a better person in the way that they are criticizing you? Or are you actually diminishing yourself? Are you actually doing worse because of that? If you think about where you're in the opposite situation, for example, where you've got a more expansive time frame, right? Does that help you do something better? And in some cases, you might notice, I make such better decisions. It's so much more clear when I give myself the time to sit down and plan out a project. I plan the steps more logically and I save time in the long run. Or when I'm with my mentor who sees me at my greatest capacity and is supportive of me, I feel so much better and I'm so much more willing to go and put my hand up and take more risks and do the hard thing. So ask yourself, if you think about other areas that are not necessarily self-talk, where you've got that pressure, that really hard pressure versus when you've got that gentle, kind voice, there's a difference. And sometimes, yes, we do need pressure. We need stress. We need deadlines. We need things to motivate us 100%. But there's also another way to do things. And sometimes that means taking a much more generous approach with yourself and letting go of the stories that are just making you feel bad and aren't helping you. So this is what I'm inviting you to let go of. And as I mentioned, we are getting progressively into things that are more challenging. And when it comes to negative self-talk, I think that in some ways, once you're onto yourself and once you start to see how much better you feel when you're not constantly berating yourself, constantly beating yourself up, not constantly giving yourself messages of, how you should be better and doing things better, then it starts to be easier to do because you realize, that story I was telling myself, it wasn't actually helping very much. So I'm okay letting it go. So forgiving yourself, being kind with yourself, giving compassion to yourself, all of those things, my guess is once you start doing more of it, it will flow more naturally. So here, what I'd love for you to do is just to simply start and start with the easiest thing to give up. So I was trying to think of examples. And one that came of mind, right? The easiest example might be something like, I'm a bad cook, right? If you're telling yourself I'm a bad cook and it's holding you back, right? You're not cooking as a result, maybe you don't want to cook. That's fine. So maybe that's not the best example, but it's an easy one because it doesn't go to your moral character unless you think being a good cook is somehow morally better than not being a good cook. But, take something that doesn't feel too heavy, where maybe you've given yourself a label and just practice what it would be like to let that go, let that label go. So some steps, how you might go about doing that is number one, if you do decide to let go of one of those messages, and the messages can be brutal, right? The messages might be something like, you're not very smart, you're too slow, you're not where you should be, you're already behind, you always waste time, you never see the big picture. I mean, there's all sorts of, they're going to see how you're a fraud. I mean, there's all these messages. And when you start to listen for them, you might start to notice what they are. And I hear them in conversations that I have with my coaching clients. And we spend time on those because I really feel like that negative self-talk, it's like having this invisible weight that is holding you back. It's keeping you small and smaller than you could be. And so I love to just wiggle that self-talk a little bit and at least loosen it up a little bit, because my view is that we don't need to be walking around being our own worst critic. I think we want to be honest with ourselves and we want to look at where there's opportunity to grow if that's what we're wanting, right? If there's an area of our life where we feel like it's important and we want to do that. But I don't think we need to go around beating ourselves up. I don't think that's going to help. So when you go to let go of an internal message, a negative story that you're telling yourself, what I would encourage you to do is, number one, you don't need to be mean about it, right? You can actually say thank you to that part of yourself that has been doing that, right? I mean, there may be a reason why you've been telling yourself that you're a bad cook, right? Maybe it protects you, right? If you say it first, then no one else can say it to you and make you feel bad. Or maybe, if you say you're a bad cook, then you don't have to cook and you don't want to cook. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. So there might be, and in that case, you might not want to let it go, right? Who knows? I mean, you need to think of an example that is meaningful to you. I just wanted to start with something easy. And so thank that part, right? Thank you. You have protected me, right? If I think about the part of me that used to blame myself for everything, right? I used to always blame myself for anything that went wrong. And it was a way of being harder on myself than anybody else could be. It was a protection mechanism. And I no longer take the blame for everything. I'll take responsibility for the pieces that I think I am responsible for. But that knee-jerk reaction, I now sometimes still have it, but I'm also a lot more fair. I'm a lot more fair and I can be thankful. Like I understand why I did that, but I'm ready to let that story go. And so you can thank that part of you. It helped you. It's like those strategies that got you to where you are. You can thank those strategies. Like, I'm glad that you got me to where I am, and it's time to let that part go. And then you can release the story. And I think sometimes you may need to release that story in stages. I mean, sometimes it'll be overnight, right? You can shift your identity, you can shift that narrative immediately, and sometimes it'll take time, right? And maybe you don't really see how it could be possible at first, in which case maybe it goes in stages. So another example was maybe being socially awkward, right? Sometimes people will say to me, oh, I'm socially awkward. And I'm always astonished because the people who tell me that they're socially awkward are often the most socially aware and delightful people. And so I'm always just baffled a little bit. So if you tell yourself, for example, that you're socially awkward, and that's a story that you've been telling yourself, and it's prevented you from going to events where you'll be around other people. Maybe you go to the events, but then you tell yourself you're socially awkward and you feel really nervous. Maybe it prevents you from going and striking up a conversation with somebody. You try to keep quiet. You kind of keep yourself in the corner of the room. And then maybe other people start to think, oh, well, maybe that person is socially awkward, even though like maybe you're not socially awkward. So the goal here is simply to notice that if that is a story and it's having an impact that isn't really one that you want, then what would happen if you just lifted that story? What if you were able to say something like, I keep thinking or I keep telling myself that I'm socially awkward, and that creates a little bit of distance, a little bit of wiggle room, and then maybe it moves up. I'm open to the possibility that I'm not socially awkward or that I'm not always socially awkward. In fact, sometimes I'm actually really good. So that is my invitation to you, is to have more wiggle room around that story that you're telling yourself, and can you let that story go? So that story, then we want to identify what the story is as best as you can. Then we want to thank that story potentially. You know, it has managed to keep you safe. It's managed to help you get to a certain level. And now we're ready to let it go. And sometimes you'll need to do that in stages, right? It's not an overnight thing where you go from thinking you're socially awkward or telling yourself that you're socially awkward to being the most outspoken or extroverted person in a room, or however you would describe the opposite of socially awkward, right? It doesn't need to be that, but it's progress, right? It's moving toward a place where you are more accepting of yourself and where the narrative that you're having with yourself is more positive. So in terms of a challenge, then I'm encouraging you to identify any stories that may be hard, that negative self-talk. And my invitation to you is to consider that it's okay to let that story go. I would encourage you to start small, pick an easy one, and go from there. And when that story is released, that will give you space to create a whole new story, which is exciting. So that brings us to the last category of things that I would encourage you to let go. And this one is a little bit more challenging. This one really is the story that is, or the item that might be really tricky. And I debated whether or not to even include it, but I've decided to go ahead with this because this is an area where I know I really struggle with this. And I imagine that other people out there probably struggle with this too. And so I would like to address it. And when it comes to releasing, letting go of things that are really hard, that maybe are things that you would be better off letting go of, one of the categories is relationships. And usually it's not the relationships with people who are not a big part of your life or an important part of your life. You know, if it's the person at the bakery and, you know, they've been having these conversations with you and I don't know, maybe they're, I don't know, for whatever reason, unpleasant, then, you know, you might have no trouble not talking to that person or going to a different bakery. Like that's an easy relationship to avoid or let go of. It's a lot harder when the relationship is with somebody who is a regular part of your life, right? Whether it's a family member sometimes. I mean, often that's where it gets really tough because you're related. There's blood, right? You're going to see that person or not. And there's a lot of social conditioning that comes along with that, a lot of social expectations that come along with that. There may be a lot of guilt, some really hard feelings that come along with that. So that's one category of relationship where, you know, you might feel like you're in a pickle, right? You don't want to sever a connection with somebody, but you're also really struggling with how that relationship is going. That's an example. It could be a really good friend or a really close friend or a long-standing friend where the relationship has changed, right? You've changed, that person has changed, and now you're just feeling like it's not a very good match. Maybe you don't feel very good when you're with that person and you don't really know what to do next. It could be a colleague at work. It could be a boss. It could be a client. It could be somebody who used to be a mentor, someone who used to be really close to you. And so there's all these areas where the people in your life may have a very important role, or they have had a previously important role. And now you're feeling like this relationship doesn't feel right anymore, and you're struggling with what to do about it. And I know for myself, this is an area, as I mentioned, where I've struggled. And for that reason, it goes deep. And so, I hesitate whether to share it on a podcast, but I think it matters. And especially in the holidays, we're around so many people who are family and friends and people who are important in our lives. And so how do we manage in those situations where it's complicated? And so the invitation here is that if you find yourself in those situations, in relationships where it's tough, what I would love for you to consider is whether that is a relationship that you want to hold on to. And it is okay to release relationships. It's hard to do, and I struggle with that. I really don't like to let relationships go when I think it is salvageable, or there's a part of that relationship that I think is so important. And so I want that person in my life in some format. So it may be that you are letting people go, or another strategy, and this is the one that I've tended to adopt with people who I really struggle with, and that is to let go of expectations, right? To let go of expectations of that person, and to let go of expectations of you in that relationship. And the you part, I think, is essential, right? It's letting go of expectations that you should be a certain way, that you should be different, that you should change who you are in order to make that other person happy. I'm giving you permission to let that go. And I'm also encouraging you to let go of the expectations of that person. And that to me is where I've also really struggled, especially when that person is someone who, using the language of should be different, that person in your view should be different. They should be kinder. They should be more supportive. They should be something. And if they're not, to let that go, to accept it. And it's hard to do sometimes, right? It's really hard to do. And yet, once you have accepted it, then there's freedom on the other side of it. You're not struggling. You're not wishing. You're not hoping. You're not arguing with reality anymore. You are accepting. And some people change, but most people are not going to change. And there's an expression that is in the back of my mind, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's about how people will show you who they are. And when they show you who they are, believe them. Or they tell you who they are, believe them, right? If people show you by the way that they are, or they tell you with their words that they are a certain way, believe them. And as much as I love to think that people can change, and I think we can all grow, we have to make that change happen for ourselves. And we know, right? I work with people who want to change all the time, right? Change jobs, change their approach, change their confidence levels, change their time management, change whatever it happens to be. And they're with me because it's hard to do sometimes. It's hard to change. So if we have trouble changing ourselves, then we can only imagine how hard it is for other people to change themselves. And chances are they're probably not going to change either. And sometimes people will make temporary changes, but then they go back to how they were. And so being accepting and letting go of expectations, I think, is really big here. So my invitation for you here is simply to give yourself permission to think about this, permission to let go of expectations of yourself that you need to be a different person in order to make somebody else happy, to be acceptable in somebody else's terms, to make somebody else, do whatever it is. Permission to let your expectations of that person go, to give up on the hope that they will be somebody who they will probably never be. And in some cases, permission to let go of the relationship. And, it doesn't have to be a big deal, right? Where there's this dramatic conversation. Like, I think movies and TV really do us a disservice in that respect, because we've all seen those dramatic scenes in the movies where it's like all drama and there's a big fight. And, real life, I have noticed, at least for me, isn't really like that. Those big fights don't really go very well. Certainly not like the magical endings in the movies. So it might just be that it's a gradual and quiet pulling back from something that just isn't working. So anyhow, so that is the last gift, is to release relationships where it just isn't working. And the test for that, I think, is how do you feel? Like, how do you feel? What feels true to you? How do you feel in that relationship? And, what do you want to do there? So to recap, and, I feel like we've gone very deep, right? We've gone from releasing some of those not essential things to something that is a lot more profound. So I would like to recap and summarize that for you. And I realize this episode is much longer than what I had anticipated sharing this week because it is a busy time. Most people are not able to spend the time listening to a podcast episode of this length, but maybe you listen to it at some point in the future and it will help you. It'll be a gift for another time of the year. But just to recap, the first gift is those extras, right? Those little things that you continue to do out of habit that you can simply let go of. The second is to release that pressure of doing everything all at once, that time pressure, that pressure to do it all at once and to have it done yesterday and to be on this certain schedule. We're going to release that. And instead, we're going to embrace the expansiveness, the freedom of taking the time that you need. We are going to release the strategies and the identities that have allowed you and enabled you to reach the level of success that you are currently at, but that are preventing you from moving forward. So we're going to thank them, we're going to appreciate them, and we're going to move to that next stage, right? We're going to start adopting those shifting and new strategies, those new identities that are more aligned with where you're going as opposed to aligned with who you were in the past. We're going to release self-talk. So we're now at number 4. We're going to release that negative self-talk, that voice in your head that thinks it's being helpful, but it's not being helpful. We're not going to get super angry with it. We're not going to have a big breakup or anything, but we're just going to thank them and say, it's time to move on to a more positive narrative, or I'm willing to let that story go. And that, of course, will make room for other stories, hopefully stories that are a little bit more supportive and that, again, are going to take you to the place where you want to be as opposed to the place that that you no longer want to be. And then finally, we're going to release relationships or parts of relationships or expectations that you have of yourself, of others in relationships, so that we are able to make room, make space for maybe a bit more peace of mind and also maybe new relationships, people who you can surround yourself with who are more aligned, more supportive, more able to help you get to the things that you want, to feel the way that you want to feel, as opposed to people who are kind of making you feel bad, right? Maybe their influence is causing you to play smaller than you want to play, and maybe it's time to play bigger. So that's my gift. Those are my gifts, 5 of them all together. And these are gifts that are not going to take up space in your cupboards. They are not going to sit dusty on the shelf, I hope. They are not going to be gifts that you're going to revisit in July when you go to clean out your house or spring cleaning or whenever you do your next large purge where you go through all those things that you hold on to, but you don't really want to keep around. So letting it go. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm excited to wrap up these holidays with you, wrap up and unwrap the holidays, as it were. I'm excited to wrap up the year, 2025. It's been a beautiful year. I'm excited to start fresh in 2026. So I hope that you join me in the new year, and I wish all the best for you. So thank you so much, and I look forward to reconnecting again with you next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.